When Taehyung's mother gently questions Jimin about Jungkook, his shocking reply uncovers a secret that could destroy everything. Why not Jungkook, Jimin? Her voice was calm. Too calm. But it sliced through the quiet like a blade, and the porcelain teacup in Jimin's trembling hand nearly slipped. He didn't answer right away. Because how could he? Rain tapped softly against the windows of the Jeju villa. It was supposed to be a private dinner, just Jimin and Taehyung's family. But the timing had a cruel sense of irony. Jungkook had left just a day before, storming out of the same house after a silence that lasted years too long. And now, Taehyung's mother was looking directly at Jimin, not with suspicion, but something worse, hope. A mother's hope. That gentle, aching question was not born of malice, but of maternal instinct, a longing to fix something she didn't even fully understand. Jimin set down his cup with deliberate care, his eyes trained on the rising steam. He hadn't been able to meet her gaze since she asked the question. He was always there for you, she added, not giving up. At every award, every rehearsal, even when others gave up. Still, Jimin didn't speak. Not until the silence became unbearable. I loved him, he whispered finally, but not in the way you think. The moment he said it, something inside him collapsed. He felt it, a fissure deep within his chest. And her face, once full of quiet inquiry, faltered. What do you mean? She asked, softer this time. But Jimin shook his head, standing. No, I shouldn't be here. He moved toward the hallway, toward the safety of distance, but her voice followed him, steady and sincere. Did something happen between you and Jungkook, Jimin? He froze. The hallway light flickered above him. Everything had happened. And everything was still happening. He turned back around. Yes, he said. Something happened. And it should have stayed in the dark. He left before she could ask more. But the damage was already done. Later that night, Taehyung found his mother sitting alone in the living room, her hands folded tightly, worry etched into her features. The fire in the hearth had long since died out. What did you say to him? Taehyung asked, already suspecting. She looked up at him slowly. I asked about Jungkook. Taehyung's face drained of color. Outside, thunder cracked. Inside, silence reigned. 2 days passed. Neither Jungkook nor Jimin answered their phones. The internet, however, was ablaze. A blurry photo of Jimin leaving the Jeju villa late at night had made its rounds. Speculations exploded, armies dissecting every detail, from his hunched posture to the red in his eyes. Some said heartbreak. Some said betrayal. But no one knew. Taehyung did? He remembered the way Jungkook had looked at Jimin on stage last year. The way Jimin had avoided his gaze. The way silence hung between them like heavy velvet every time they were in the same room. He knew. He confronted Jimin days later at the studio. I told her, Jimin said before Taehyung could speak. Your mom. I didn't mean to, but I did. Taehyung's jaw clenched. What did you say? That I loved him. But not like that. Not the way I should have. Taehyung looked away. He's not okay, Jimin. I know, Jimin whispered. Neither am I. In Seoul, Jungkook was trying to forget. But forgetting wasn't the same as healing. And healing wasn't something he'd allowed himself in years. The question haunted him every night since he left Jeju. Why not Jungkook? He had asked himself that so many times in the mirror. In hotel, bathrooms, on tour buses, in the echo of stadiums where fans screamed his name while his heart screamed for someone else. And now someone else had said it, Taehyung's mother, no less. And Jimin? He answered with a truth that felt worse than silence. Not in the way you think. He laughed bitterly. Maybe he had always been chasing a ghost. Maybe the version of Jimin he loved only existed in memories, in between the notes of a song, in the shadowed corners of backstage moments no one else saw. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Because Jimin had loved him back. He had felt it, hadn't he? Jimin wandered the Han River that night, his coat soaked through from the drizzle, his thoughts heavier than the clouds overhead. He hadn't spoken to Jungkook since Jeju. Hadn't dared. But the guilt was corroding him. Not just guilt for what he said, but for what he didn't. He should have said yes. He should have said, why not Jungkook? Because Jungkook had been everything. The problem was, when someone becomes everything, they also become the thing you're most afraid to lose. So you sabotage, so you lie, so you run, and Jimin had been running for years. Taehyung sat across from Jungkook days later, in a cafe that once held laughter and shared secrets. She didn't mean to hurt you, Taehyung said, no judgment in his voice, only history. I know, Jungkook replied. But she did, yeah. Taehyung took a slow sip of his coffee, watching the storm outside. I think, he began, if you ever asked him again, this time maybe he'd stay. Jungkook didn't answer, but his fingers clenched around his cup, and for the first time in months, he looked hopeful. Not certain, not healed, but hopeful. And sometimes, that's enough. Jimin stood in front of the mirror in his apartment, the city lights casting fractured shadows across the floor, and he couldn't stop hearing her voice. Why not Jungkook? It echoed louder than any concert stage, clearer than any melody he had ever sung. The question wasn't just a mother's curiosity anymore. It had become a haunting verdict, peeling open every layer he had tried so carefully to seal. His reflection stared back with hollow eyes and parted lips, as if trying to confess something that wouldn't come out. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool glass, and let out a trembling breath. The steam from his shower was still clinging to the room, fogging everything except the truth. He remembered Jungkook's laugh, the kind that used to burst out of him uncontrollably, unapologetically. He remembered how Jungkook used to wait for him after practice, lingering in the shadows of the hall like he was just waiting for a sign Jimin never gave. He remembered the day Jungkook stopped waiting, and he remembered the way it broke him quietly, without any sound, like a string snapping inside his chest. There were footsteps now, soft against the hallway tile. Yoongi's voice called through the door, careful but firm. Hyung, it's time. Jimin didn't answer. Not right away. When he finally stepped out, dressed in black and layered in silence, the others didn't say much. They didn't have to. The air was thick with unspoken things. The private memorial concert for their late manager was already beginning backstage, and the press had been cleared this was only for family, for friends, for those who remembered the man behind their beginnings. But Jimin wasn't thinking about the stage. His mind was still at the villa, still with Taehyung's mother's eyes piercing through his own, like she had seen something hidden even from himself. As they filed toward the green room, Namjoon pulled him aside. You okay? He asked, voice low. Jimin nodded too quickly. Namjoon didn't buy it. You've been somewhere else since Jeju. Jimin looked away. She asked me why it wasn't Jungkook. Namjoon went still. I told her the truth, Jimin added, his voice breaking like thin ice. But even truth sounds like betrayal when it comes late. Namjoon said nothing for a long time. And then, very quietly, what would you say if he asked again? Jimin didn't know. And maybe that was the most painful part. Later, on stage, the lights burned hot but felt cold. The seat next to him was empty. Jungkook hadn't come. Everyone had been invited. But not everyone came. Jimin sang anyway. Not because he wanted to, but because he owed it to the memory, to the silence, to the version of himself he used to be when Jungkook believed in him without hesitation. After the last song ended, he didn't wait for applause. He walked off stage, pulled his jacket tighter, and disappeared into the maze of backstage corridors. Jungkook was in the studio. Not singing, not dancing, just sitting there with headphones on, letting white noise fill his ears until it drowned out the questions. The door opened, and he didn't turn around. I thought you'd be there tonight, Taehyung said gently. Jungkook sighed, removing one side of the headphones. I couldn't, he murmured. Taehyung came and sat beside him on the floor. She told Jimin. I figured. He broke down after. Jungkook's jaw clenched. What did she say? He asked, even though he already knew. She asked why not you? Jungkook let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his palms over his face. That question's older than us. Taehyung tilted his head toward him. You ever going to ask him again? Jungkook leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closed. You don't get to keep asking the same question when the answer never changes. Maybe the answer's changed now. I'm tired of gambling with hope. You're not gambling, Taehyung said softly. You're surviving. We all are. There was a long silence between them. Then Taehyung handed him something, an old photo, dog-eared and faint. It was the three of them. In a hallway after a show, Jimin wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Jungkook. Jungkook stared at it for a long time. Then he stood. The wind was cold outside the building, brushing against Jimin's skin like apology. He hadn't moved for over an hour, standing at the edge of the rooftop, not close enough to the edge to be reckless, but far enough to feel distance from everything below. He heard the footsteps long before he saw the figure. Jungkook. The silence between them was louder than the city. I thought you wouldn't come, Jimin said, his voice a ghost. Jungkook stopped a few steps behind him. You thought wrong. Jimin turned slowly, their eyes locking in the dim rooftop light. I never wanted to hurt you, Jimin said. But I did. Over and over. You did, Jimin swallowed. I didn't say yes because I was scared. Of what? Of how much I felt for you. Of how real you made everything feel. Of losing you if I said yes and things didn't work. Jungkook's eyes shone with restrained emotion. But you lost me anyway. I know. A pause. I never stopped waiting, you know, Jungkook whispered. Even after I said I did. Jimin stepped forward. Then let me ask you now. Jungkook blinked. Why not me? Jimin said. The question hung in the air like a challenge, like a plea. Jungkook took a breath that shook at the edges. Because I stopped believing you'd ever choose me. And if I do now? Jungkook stepped closer. I need you to mean it. I do. A beat. Jungkook searched his eyes, looking for cracks, for hesitation. But there were none. So he nodded. Just once. And when Jimin reached for his hand, Jungkook didn't pull away. They stood there as the wind moved around them. Not fixing the past, but maybe finally beginning something new. Not with promises, not with perfect words, but with presence. And maybe that was enough. The morning after was painted in shades of hesitant light, the kind of cold blue dawn that stretches over Seoul after a sleepless night. The city buzzed in its usual rhythm, cars passing in pulses, heels tapping against sidewalks, but Jimin's apartment was unusually still. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything that hadn't needed to be said last night. The kind of silence that follows a breaking point, not with emptiness, but with a strange, delicate peace. Jimin sat cross-legged on the floor of his living room, hair still damp from a quick shower, his phone lying screen up beside him. He hadn't opened any notifications, hadn't checked the online chaos that had no doubt continued without mercy. His world, at least for this moment, was offline, focused, grounded. Jungkook was still asleep in the next room, curled on the sofa under a blanket he'd refused at first. He had always been stubborn like that, stubborn and proud and soft in all the ways he didn't want people to see. Last night had unraveled something between them, something too long left, entangled in silence and regret. But now, the air felt different. Charged. Alive. Jimin exhaled slowly, glancing toward the hallway. It hadn't been a reconciliation in the dramatic, cinematic way people imagine. There were no declarations, no desperate embraces in the rain. It had been quiet, painful, honest. And that's what made it real. The door creaked, and Jungkook appeared. Shirt rumpled, hair a chaotic mess that would have earned a teasing comment under any other circumstance. But Jimin said nothing. He just offered a soft smile and gestured to the mug on the table beside him. It's still warm. Jungkook sat across from him without a word, accepting the tea with both hands like it might shatter if he didn't hold it gently enough. They sat in that gentle silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. It was Jungkook who finally broke it. You didn't sleep. It wasn't a question. Jimin didn't deny it. I was thinking. About? Jimin hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the window where the sky was beginning to blush with gold. About what comes next? Jungkook sipped his tea. Does there have to be a next? Jimin looked at him. There always is. Whether we choose it or not. Jungkook set the mug down carefully, fingers lingering on the ceramic. Then, I want to choose it. With you. The words settled like a weight in Jimin's chest, heavy, warm, grounding. But he didn't smile. Not yet. It's not that simple, he said. Jungkook's expression didn't change. I know. Jimin ran a hand through his hair, his voice low. There's still Taehyung. Jungkook's eyes flickered, but he nodded. I'm not asking you to forget him. I didn't just hurt you, Jimin added. I hurt him too. I hurt all of us. Jungkook leaned back slightly, his arms crossed over his knees. Do you still love him? Jimin didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, the silence stretching. I think, he began carefully, I loved what we were, the history, the comfort. But it wasn't him who made me stay up at night. It wasn't him I looked for when I was hurting. He finally looked up. It was always you. Jungkook's breath caught, his throat tightening. He hadn't realized how long he'd waited to hear those words until they landed inside him like a second heartbeat. But I need to make things right, Jimin continued. Not just between us, but with him too. We're still a family. Whatever that means now. Jungkook nodded, slowly, understanding without fully agreeing. But he didn't push. He'd done enough pushing in the past. This time, he would let things unfold the way they were meant to, without pressure, without force. That afternoon, Jimin left a message for Taehyung. Not a long one, just enough to ask for a meeting. Taehyung didn't respond until the next day. Just a time and a place. No emojis, no warmth. But he agreed. They met in a quiet cafe in Mapogu, where the staff recognized them but respected their space. Taehyung was already seated when Jimin arrived, his sunglasses still on despite the dim light. He didn't stand, just tilted his chin slightly in acknowledgement. Jimin sat down across from him, hands on his lap, waiting. Taehyung removed his glasses slowly, revealing eyes that were tired, shadowed, but unreadable. So, he said, voice clipped, you're finally ready to talk. I should have come sooner, Jimin admitted. Yeah, Taehyung said. You should have. There was a pause. Long. Suffocating. Jimin's voice trembled, but he held eye contact. I told your mother the truth. Taehyung's jaw flexed. I know. She asked why not Jungkook? And you told her. That. I loved him. But I wasn't brave enough to choose him. Taehyung's eyes darkened. And now you've chosen. I'm trying to, Jimin said softly, but not without owning what I've done. You think that's enough? No, Jimin admitted. But it's a start. Taehyung leaned back, folding his arms, letting the silence burn between them. I loved you, Jimin, he said, his voice low, but thick with everything he'd buried. Maybe I still do, but I don't know who you are anymore. Not after what you did to him. To me. To us. Jimin blinked rapidly. I didn't know how to stop lying to myself. That's not an excuse. It's not, Jimin agreed. But it's the truth. Taehyung looked away, staring out the window at a passing bus, his throat bobbing. I'm not here to ask you to forgive me, Jimin added. I just wanted you to know that I'm not running anymore. That I remember everything. The laughter, the fights, the moments we never talked about but still shaped us. Taehyung was quiet. For a long time. Then he said, and if I told you I still have a place for you in my life, but not the same one, I'd say I understand. Another pause. Taehyung's eyes returned to him. Then maybe that's enough for now. Jimin smiled for the first time. Small? Broken? Real. Thank you, he said. When he left the cafe, he didn't feel healed, but he felt lighter, like the burden he'd carried for too long had finally been spoken aloud. That night, Jungkook was waiting outside his apartment. He didn't ask what happened with Taehyung. He just opened his arms, and Jimin walked into them. Their silence this time wasn't about pain. It was about comfort. About knowing that the hardest words had finally been said. That the wreckage between them hadn't been cleared, but it had been seen. Named. Weeks passed. They didn't go public. Not yet. The media had already written enough versions of their story to fill 100 headlines. This time, it was theirs. They wrote music together again. Quietly at first, then more. And in the booth one night, after hours of recording, Jimin caught Jungkook watching him through the glass. Not with expectation, not with pressure, just with awe. Jimin smiled, lowering his mic. "What?" he mouthed. Jungkook shrugged, his eyes soft. "I'm just glad you're here." Jimin's heart twisted not with regret, but with gratitude. Soing. There were still things to face. Still fears. Still wounds that might reopen. But for the first time, they weren't afraid to face them together. And sometimes, that was the beginning of everything. The winter wind had begun to lose its bite, yet the air still held the ghost of December. It was late, almost midnight, but the streets of Seoul were alive, traffic lights blinking on deserted intersections, neon signs humming above closed storefronts, the city breathing in and out like a restless heart. Jimin stood on the rooftop of Hybe's practice building, hood pulled low, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, staring at the sprawling skyline that looked both infinite and far too close. Behind him, the elevator door hadn't closed yet. He knew Jungkook was still inside, watching him. He didn't turn around. He could hear Jungkook step out, slow and measured. The door shut, with a metallic sigh behind him, cutting off the rest of the world. Now, it was just them, and the noise of the city below. Jungkook didn't speak at first. He came to stand beside Jimin, the way he used to when neither of them had the strength to say what they needed to say. His presence was solid and familiar, like gravity unchanging, undeniable. "I saw the photos of you and Taehyung," he said quietly, his breath visible in the cold. Jimin's eyes didn't leave the horizon. "It was just coffee." "I know." Another pause. Jimin's fingers curled inside his pockets. "I needed to know," he said finally, "if there was anything left. Not because I wanted it, but because I had to let it go the right way." Jungkook nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the same skyline. "And? There's nothing," Jimin whispered. "Nothing but memories." Jungkook's jaw shifted, and Jimin caught the flicker of hesitation in his profile. He turned to look at him. Really look at him. The way he hadn't done in weeks. Not through a screen, not over a mic, not in the blurred exhaustion of rehearsals, but fully, clearly, as if the night had cleared the air around them. "I'm sorry I made you doubt," Jimin said. "Sorry I made you wait. You were never second. I just didn't know how to let myself believe you'd still be there when I was ready." Jungkook's gaze dropped to the rooftop beneath their feet, then slowly rose back to meet Jimin's. "I almost wasn't." "I know," Jimin said. "But you are." "Huh." The silence that followed was heavy with something new. Something not quite forgiveness, not quite reconciliation, but the beginning of both. Jungkook exhaled slowly, letting the cold bite at his lungs. "I don't want to be the secret anymore," he said. "Not from the world, not from the band, not from your fears." Jimin's throat tightened. "You're not. Not anymore." "Then say it." "What? Say you love me?" Jimin's breath caught. "I need to hear it from the version of you that doesn't run anymore." Jimin stepped closer, the sound of his boots soft on the concrete. He reached out, took Jungkook's hand in both of his, cold fingers brushing against his pulse. "I love you," he said steady and raw, "and I'm not running. Not this time." Jungkook closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing the words, letting them settle into the cracks. When he opened them, there was something lighter in his gaze. A smile ghosted the corner of his mouth, brief and devastatingly soft. They stood there in silence again, no longer broken. The wind moved around them like a song, and for the first time, in a long time, it didn't feel like it was trying to tear them apart. Weeks passed, not in silence but in rebuilding. Their relationship wasn't stitched together overnight. It came with awkward mornings, quiet dinners, unfinished conversations that hung in the air like dust, waiting to be swept clean. But they kept showing up, every day. No more missed calls, no more cryptic posts, no more letting pride speak louder than their hearts. The band noticed. Of course they did. Yoongi was the first to pull Jungkook aside after a late-night session. "You look different," he said bluntly, arms crossed as he leaned against the hallway wall. "Good or bad?" Yoongi shrugged. You're smiling again. That's suspicious. Jungkook chuckled under his breath. It's working. Whatever it is, we're figuring it out. Yoongi nodded. Just don't disappear again. We're not 12 anymore. Jungkook's smile faded into something serious. I won't. Jimin had his own reckoning too. It came quietly, backstage at an interview shoot, when Seokjin found him sitting alone, scrolling through old videos of them moments when everything had been easier, laughter unburdened, touches careless, emotions less dangerous. You okay? Seokjin asked, lowering himself beside him. Jimin gave a small nod. Just watching ghosts. Seokjin tilted his head. You afraid they'll come back? Jimin thought for a moment. No, I'm afraid I'll forget them. Seokjin gave a soft smile. You won't. That's the curse and the gift of memory. It stays even when you don't want it to. Jimin turned to him. Do you think people will understand? If we ever tell them? Seokjin's smile widened. Some will, some won't. But the ones who matter already do. Jimin exhaled, tension easing from his shoulders. I hope so. Spring crept into the city before they knew it. The cherry blossoms began to bloom, and with them came new beginnings. There were rumors online, fans speculating about subtle glances, shared lyrics, cryptic captions. But nothing was confirmed. Not until the night of their comeback stage.
It was a global live broadcast. Cameras everywhere, pressure thick as always. The stage lights blinding, the crowd silent in anticipation. Their final song was a ballad, a new one. Written by Jungkook, arranged by Jimin, lyrics carved from truths they hadn't dared to sing until now. Jimin stood at center stage, mic trembling in his hand as the spotlight found him. He looked to his right. Jungkook was already watching him, eyes soft, steady. And then it happened. A single glance. A smile shared not just between idols, but between souls. Armies saw it. The moment that wasn't rehearsed. The subtle brushing of fingers as they passed each other. The pause that lingered half a second too long. The silent communication that needed no words. And when the final note fell, Jungkook turned to the mic, heart racing. He looked into the camera, into the homes of millions, and simply said, "Thank you for waiting." That was all. Nothing more. But it was enough. The world exploded. The internet fractured. And Jimin, standing beside him, reached out and took his hand. Not hidden, not denied. Just held. Afterward, backstage was chaos. Staff running, interviews lined up, phones buzzing nonstop. But Jimin and Jungkook found each other in the quiet of the dressing room. You did it, Jimin whispered, still breathless. No, Jungkook replied, pulling him in by the waist. We did. They kissed, not for the cameras, not for the spectacle, but because the moment demanded it. Because love, when finally unburdened, needs to be claimed. They spent the night at Jimin's apartment, wrapped around each other in the dark, talking about everything and nothing. Plans, fears, what it meant to live a truth that the world might not always embrace. But they weren't afraid anymore. The next morning, a bouquet arrived at their door. No card, but they both knew. Taehyung. The flowers were white hyacinths for forgiveness. Jimin placed them in water, heart aching and full. Their story hadn't ended, it had only shifted. There were still songs to write, stages to fill, miles to travel. But they'd do it together now, not just as artists, but as something more. Something real. Something that had survived everything trying to break it. And in that quiet morning light, Jimin knew. The question was, why not Jungkook anymore? The answer had always been him. The apartment was still filled with the scent of blossoms when the knock came at the door, firm, measured, like someone unsure if they were truly welcome. Jimin glanced up from the couch where he had been curled under a blanket, lyrics scrawled across the pages of a worn notebook in his lap. The knock came again. Jungkook looked at him from the kitchen, a silent question in his eyes. Jimin nodded once. He stood, heart already racing even before he turned the handle. When the door opened, Taehyung stood there, hands in the pockets of a tan trench coat, hair ruffled by the wind, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes as they met Jimin's. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice low. Jimin stepped aside without a word. Jungkook had already taken 2 steps forward into the living room, tense, uncertain. The silence that followed Taehyung's entrance was palpable, heavy, alive with memories, with fractured bonds that still pulsed under their skin. Taehyung didn't look around. He looked directly at Jungkook. "I didn't send the flowers to make a statement," he said. "I sent them because I meant it." Jungkook didn't move. "I know. I also came because there's something I need to say, and I want both of you to hear it." Jimin slowly sat back down, unsure if he was bracing for pain or clarity, perhaps both. Taehyung remained standing, arms crossed now, jaw tight. His gaze fell briefly to the floor before he lifted it again. "I hated you," he admitted, eyes flicking to Jimin, "for choosing him, even though I always knew you would." Jimin's breath hitched. "And I hated you," Taehyung turned to Jungkook, "for being the one he always returned to, even when he wasn't ready." Jungkook's throat moved, but he didn't speak. Taehyung took a slow breath, closing his eyes for a moment. "But I hate myself more," he whispered, "for knowing I saw it years ago and said nothing. I thought if I stayed quiet long enough I could become something you pick out of safety." He looked at Jimin again. "But I was never safety. I was just delaying the inevitable." No one spoke. The confession floated in the stillness like smoke, impossible to grasp but impossible to ignore. "And now?" Jimin asked, voice a rasp. Taehyung gave a small, broken smile. "Now I'm just tired of pretending I don't miss the both of you." A silence settled that wasn't painful. It was the kind that formed when old wounds were finally exposed to light. "You're still family," Jungkook said softly. Taehyung let out a quiet laugh. "We're all too broken for labels like that." Jimin stood, walked forward and reached for his hand. "I'm sorry," he said. Taehyung looked down at their joined hands. "So am I." They stood there, the 3 of them, not healed but not bleeding anymore either. There were scars, certainly, but they weren't afraid to touch them now. That night they didn't speak much more. They ate dinner together like old times, quietly exchanging glances that held the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. Taehyung left just before midnight, standing in the doorway with his hand on Jimin's shoulder and a look in his eyes that was part blessing, part goodbye. "I'll be okay," he said. "You both should be too." And then he was gone. Jimin closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a long moment, tears falling without warning. Jungkook came to him, pulled him close, and held him like he would never let go again. Time passed, the world moved forward with them in it, news cycles changed. The public forgot old headlines, but the music remained. Their next project was a duet. It wasn't marketed as a romantic revelation, but fans knew. The rawness of the lyrics, the way they looked at each other on stage, the subtle tremble in their harmonies, it all told a story that had taken years to write. And still, they kept some pieces just for themselves. Like the way Jungkook would trace the curve of Jimin's wrist with his thumb when he thought no one was watching. Or how Jimin would smile at him backstage before every show, a private reassurance that he was still choosing him, every time. HYBE did interfere. Perhaps they had grown tired of fighting the inevitable. Perhaps they finally understood that authenticity sold better than the polished lie. Taehyung went quiet for a while, retreating into art and travel, exploring parts of himself he had neglected while chasing what never truly belonged to him. He would send postcards now and then. Jimin kept them in a box on his desk, never shown to anyone but Jungkook. One day, months later, Jimin found Jungkook at the piano. The melody was unfamiliar but soft, hopeful. He didn't stop playing when Jimin approached. Instead, he shifted on the bench, offering space without speaking. Jimin sat beside him, their thighs touching. "What's this one?" he asked. "I don't know," Jungkook replied. "I was waiting for the lyrics." Jimin reached for the notebook nearby and began to write, each word sliding out with an ease he hadn't felt in years. When they finished the song, they sat in silence, letting it echo in the space between them. "I think this is the happiest I've ever been," Jimin said. Jungkook looked at him, all softness and certainty. "Then let's stay here," he whispered. And they did. Not in a single place, but in each other. In a world that moved too fast, that broke things and people and dreams, they built something that bent without breaking. A story not of perfection, but of persistence. Of falling, of hurting, of choosing each other again and again despite everything. And somewhere in the quiet of that choice, they found peace. Real. Earned. Undeniable. Rain had begun to fall by the time they left the studio, soft and steady, the kind that didn't rush to drench but lingered on the skin like a second breath. Jimin tilted his face up toward the sky, his lashes catching droplets like the delicate edge of a petal. Behind him, Jungkook locked the door, slipping the key into his coat pocket without speaking. There was no need. Their silence had long ago evolved from avoidance into something sacred, communicative, intimate. It wasn't emptiness that passed between them now. It was understanding. And when Jungkook reached out, fingers brushing Jimin's wrist before lacing their hands together, Jimin squeezed once in return and smiled without needing to look. They walked like that through the quiet street, the world around them dim with late-night hush, puddles reflecting scattered city light. The hum of electricity buzzing low behind signboards and shuttered shops. The day had been long, recording, meetings, edits, rewrites, but neither of them felt the exhaustion the way they used to. Maybe because they weren't carrying regret on their backs anymore. Maybe because peace, once earned, lightened even the heaviest load. The car ride home was filled with the low rumble of Jungkook's playlist. Old songs. Songs from their early years, before the heartbreaks, before the betrayals, before their hearts knew how fragile time could be. Jimin leaned his head against the window, watching the raindrops race one another down the glass. "Remember when we recorded in Busan for the first time?" he asked softly. Jungkook gave a soft chuckle. "You cried on the balcony after we finished the bridge." Jimin smiled. "I thought you'd forgotten." "I remember everything." There was weight in his words. Not the kind that burdened, but the kind that reminded Jimin how far they had come. When they got home, the apartment was dark, save for the soft amber glow of the lamp by the bookshelf. Jungkook toed off his shoes and padded into the kitchen. Jimin followed, watching as Jungkook moved through the space with familiarity, pouring tea, setting out 2 cups, his silhouette painted in warmth against the dim light. They sat on the floor by the window, legs tangled, tea in their hands and the rain tapping gently against the glass. "I saw Taehyung today," Jungkook murmured. Jimin looked up, startled but not alarmed. "When?" "This afternoon in the corridor. He was coming out of the executive office." Jimin swallowed. "Did you speak?" Jungkook nodded. "He said he's moving to Paris for a while." Jimin stared at his tea. "He told me once he wanted to disappear into a city that didn't know his name." "Said he's not disappearing, just restarting." Jimin nodded slowly, guilt and relief tangled in his chest. "Did he say anything else?" Jungkook hesitated. "Then he said he hopes we don't mess it up this time." Jimin let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That sounds like him." They were quiet again for a while, the kind of stillness that belonged only to people who had lived through the worst parts of one another. "Do you still think about what we lost?" Jimin asked. Jungkook looked at him. Jimin's brows lifted slightly. "Never. Not in the way you mean. I used to think of it as loss, as wasted years, but now, I think of it as everything we needed to go through to become this." He gestured gently between them, "to be here, not as versions of ourselves pretending to be okay, but as who we really are, honest, ugly, human." Jimin felt something hot sting his eyes. "You always say the right thing." Jungkook smiled. "No, I just finally stopped being afraid to say the true thing." They stayed there until the rain slowed into mist, the city falling into deeper silence. At some point, Jimin fell asleep against Jungkook's shoulder, breath slow and even, his hand still wrapped loosely around the mug. Jungkook didn't move. He didn't want to, because This quiet, vulnerable domesticity was everything he had ever wanted. Not the stages, not the fame, just this moment and the boy he had waited years to finally hold like this with no more what-ifs. The next morning, the headlines were flooded with speculation. Photos from their live performance had gone viral overnight, screenshots of hands brushing, of stares lingering too long, of that single, unguarded smile Jimin had sent Jungkook as they walked off stage. The fan theories had reignited. The edits. The threads. But the difference now was this: neither of them panicked. Neither of them called a manager in distress. Neither of them hid. Instead, they laughed over it at breakfast, Jimin reading fan tweets aloud while Jungkook stirred sugar into his coffee. "Someone said we gave married energy," Jimin chuckled, scrolling. Jungkook raised a brow. "Do we?" Jimin looked at him over the top of his phone. "Do you want to?" Jungkook didn't flinch. "One day if you do." Jimin put his phone down slowly. "I do." The simplicity of the moment stunned them both. It wasn't a proposal, it wasn't grand, but it was real, and it meant everything. In the weeks that followed, their schedule grew heavier. Concert dates, interviews, global travel. But wherever they went, they made time for long walks, for unspoken reassurances, for holding hands under coats in airports. The world continued to guess, to speculate, to debate. But for once, it didn't matter. The truth didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be lived. And they did, every day, without apology, without permission. Just love, worn like armor, soft and visible for those willing to see. Because the question had been asked long ago, why not Jungkook? And now, finally, eternally, the answer was Jimin. The hotel room in Tokyo was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic from 17 stories below. The curtains were only half drawn, letting in the scattered lights of the city, glowing red, yellow, and white like embers drifting in the dark. Jimin stood near the window, a glass of water in his hand, fingers loose around the rim. He wasn't thirsty. He hadn't touched the water in minutes. His gaze was fixed on the skyline, but his mind was far from the present. Behind him, Jungkook sat on the edge of the bed, arms resting on his knees, eyes watching the way Jimin's silhouette curved against the pane of glass. They hadn't spoken since entering the room, not because something was wrong, but because something had shifted. Something they hadn't named yet. Jimin turned slightly, as if sensing the weight of Jungkook's gaze. His features were calm, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the storm beneath. Jungkook stood and crossed the room slowly, every step deliberate, not wanting to shatter the fragile moment that hovered between them. When he reached him, he didn't say a word. Just reached forward, took the glass gently from Jimin's hand and set it on the windowsill. His fingers then came to rest on Jimin's waist, tentative at first, like a question. Jimin leaned into the touch, letting his forehead drop to Jungkook's shoulder, exhaling against his neck. "It still scares me," he whispered. Jungkook didn't ask what. He already knew. Visibility, exposure, the risk of losing everything they had fought to rebuild, for the sake of something the world might never fully understand or accept. "I know," Jungkook murmured, his voice low, his hand tracing slow circles on Jimin's back. "But I don't want to hide anymore." "You don't have to." Jimin looked up at him, eyes soft with exhaustion but lit by something steadier than fear. "What if this is our only moment of peace?" he asked. Jungkook's thumb brushed across his cheekbone. "Then let's make it count." Their lips met not in haste but in reverence. A kiss that spoke not of hunger but of survival, of everything endured, of every apology that had already been forgiven. They didn't rush it. They never did now. Time had taught them that real love required patience, not declarations, devotion, not drama. And as the city glimmered around them, the world outside of the room faded away. Later, when they lay in bed tangled together, skin against skin, breath warm on collarbones, Jimin's fingers traced the tattoo ink on Jungkook's arm. The familiar design, once just art, now held deeper meaning to him. A map of pain, triumph, and identity. "Do you ever regret not saying it sooner?" Jimin asked into the quiet. Jungkook's eyes flickered open, saying what? "That you loved me." Jungkook turned his head, his voice a whisper against Jimin's temple. "I didn't say it, but I sang it." Jimin smiled faintly. Yeah, I know. And you? I think I said it in all the wrong ways, Jimin said. With distance, with silence, with jealousy I pretended wasn't there. But you're saying it now. I'm screaming it now. Jungkook chuckled softly, pulling Jimin closer until they were chest to chest. No need to scream, he said. I hear you. The next morning came too fast. Their alarms buzzed before the sun had fully risen, and the soft world they had created overnight was quickly invaded by wardrobe fittings, managers, stylists, and makeup artists. But something was different. Even as they stood side by side in front of the mirror, being touched up for a shoot, they didn't feel like ghosts of themselves anymore. They looked alive, anchored. During the interview later that afternoon, a reporter, cheeky, curious, maybe just reckless, asked about the rumors. You two have always been close, she said, eyes gleaming. But lately fans say you've become inseparable. Any comments? There was a beat of silence. Then Jimin glanced at Jungkook. And Jungkook, in that moment, made a decision that would echo for years. He reached for Jimin's hand and laced their fingers together on the table, not as a performance, not for drama, but with quiet certainty. I think, Jungkook said, voice steady, that when you find something worth protecting, you stop hiding from it. The room went still. The camera lenses didn't click, they froze, but they had already said enough. That clip would go viral before they even returned to the hotel. It would divide opinions, break headlines, trend across countries. But when the elevator doors closed behind them, they leaned into each other and laughed. The kind of laugh that comes only from release, from truth. Not everyone approved. There were phone calls, emails, warnings. HYBE's PR team scrambled, but the boys didn't waver. Taehyung sent them a text, proud of you. Took long enough. Yoongi replied to the clip with a single comment on Instagram, about damn time. Namjoon messaged privately with a string of heart emojis followed by I'll handle the boardroom, just be happy. And so they were. They weren't reckless, they weren't loud, but they were undeniable now. And strangely, the storm died faster than expected. The fans who had always suspected greeted them with love. Those who didn't understand faded into the background. The music spoke louder than the gossip. Their performances were more electric than ever. Their synergy on stage became legend. They didn't need to label what they had. They simply lived it, every touch, every lyric, every shared glance. It was all right there for those willing to see. Months later, on a spring day in Paris, Jungkook surprised Jimin with a ring, not flashy, not headline-worthy, just a silver band engraved with the date they first sang their truth. Jimin didn't cry. He just slipped it on and said, I'm not scared anymore. They didn't call it a proposal. They didn't need a ceremony. Their whole life had become a vow, and in the end it wasn't about who they had been before the pain. It was about who they chose to be after it, for each other, for real. And when Jimin stood on stage during their next world tour and whispered, "My home," into the mic while looking at Jungkook, the audience didn't scream. They gasped. Because everyone finally understood. This wasn't fan service. This was a love story. And it had been unfolding in plain sight all along. The summer air in Seoul clung to the skin like memory, warm, heavy, inescapable. Jimin stood backstage at the stadium, staring at the sea of flickering lights just beyond the curtain. The crowd was humming, chanting in waves that pulsed like a heartbeat, unified and electric. Somewhere behind him, staff moved quickly, voices muffled by earpieces, footsteps quiet against the polished floor. But in Jimin's ears, there was only the sound of his breath and the distant echo of Jungkook's voice from the dressing room minutes earlier. You don't have to say anything tonight if you're not ready. But he was. He hadn't always been. There had been a time when fear wrapped around his ribs tighter than any harness ever could, fear of being seen, misunderstood, misrepresented. Fear that if he stepped fully into who he loved, who he truly was, he would unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. But that time was gone now, buried beneath everything they had endured, everything they had healed through together. And tonight, in front of tens of thousands, he wasn't afraid anymore. The lights dimmed. The roar of the crowd surged like a tide breaking against the shore. The opening chords of their last song began, soft and slow. Notes Jungkook had written on a quiet morning, still barefoot, still half asleep, as Jimin made coffee and hummed absent-mindedly at the window. It had started as a melody. It had become a promise. Jimin stepped out onto the stage, his body moving as if the music had always lived inside his bones. Beside him, Jungkook appeared, breath syncing with his own, every glance charged with everything unsaid but deeply known. The screen behind them bloomed with soft light, the lyrics rising like a heartbeat, and their voices collided in harmony, clear, aching, undeniable. They didn't need to look at each other, not really. They could feel it. The way their energies aligned, the way their hearts no longer hesitated. And when the bridge came, Jimin's solo, he stepped toward the center, hand gripping the mic, eyes scanning the crowd not for validation but for courage. He didn't say Jungkook's name. He didn't have to. He just said, "I found my truth. I'm standing beside it." The reaction was immediate, not explosive, not wild, but reverent. A hush spread through the stadium like shared breath. Some people cried, some whispered, some smiled with quiet joy. And Jungkook, standing a few steps behind, placed a hand over his heart and bowed his head, not in shame but in gratitude. After the show, they walked off stage together, hands brushing, eyes locked in a silent conversation that no one else needed to hear. In the dressing room, away from the lights, away from the noise, Jimin leaned into him and rested his forehead against Jungkook. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The hum of adrenaline was still buzzing beneath their skin, but there was a calm beneath it, deeper than sound, deeper than any lyric. "You were beautiful," Jungkook murmured. Jimin smiled against his cheek. "You were brave first." They didn't go to the after-party. They didn't do the press. They returned home, still in their stage clothes, shoes kicked off by the door. Jimin peeled off his shirt, skin still glistening, and collapsed onto the couch. Jungkook followed moments later, falling beside him, head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we never said anything?" Jimin asked softly. Jungkook tilted his head, considering. "Sometimes, but then I remember how unhappy we were pretending." Jimin's fingers laced through his. "Yeah." There were still moments of uncertainty, of course. They lived in a world that dissected every glance, every touch. But they had stopped explaining, stopped defending, started simply being, together, real. When the documentary crew proposed the idea, a behind-the-scenes look at their tour, their process, their lives, they hesitated. Not because they didn't want to share, but because they had learned to protect what mattered. But it was Namjoon who convinced them. "If you don't tell your own story, someone else will write it for you," he said. And so they did. The footage was raw, honest. No scripts, no filters, just long nights in the studio, disagreements over production, laughter during rehearsals, exhaustion after sound checks, and in between, quiet moments. Jimin lying on Jungkook's lap in the van, Jungkook zipping up Jimin's jacket before a shoot, the look they exchanged after a particularly emotional performance in Santiago, eyes rimmed red, hands clutching each other's in the dark. The documentary didn't need narration. It spoke for itself. When it aired, the response was overwhelming. Not everyone was kind, but the ones who mattered, the fans who had grown with them, who had felt every lyric, every pause, embraced them with unwavering love. Jimin received a letter from a young fan in Argentina. It was handwritten, pages folded carefully, words pressed hard into the paper. "You made me feel seen. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was wrong for loving who I love. Thank you for showing me it's okay to be honest." Jimin read it twice, then a third time. Then he placed it in the drawer beside his bed, where he kept only the most precious things. Later that night, he showed it to Jungkook. "We did that," Jimin said quietly. Jungkook looked at him, eyes tender. "No," he said, "you did." Their lives didn't become easier. Fame never sleeps. Schedules remained punishing. Cameras were always near, but they had each other, and that changed everything. Taehyung returned from Paris 6 months later. He looked different, lighter, calmer. His hair was longer, dyed soft brown. He had picked up photography and spoken about starting an art exhibit. When they reunited, it wasn't awkward. There were hugs, drinks, long conversations over wine and rooftop views. The three of them sat for hours talking about everything and nothing, and when Jimin leaned into Jungkook's side during a laugh, Taehyung simply smiled and raised his glass. To surviving. To living, Jungkook added. To loving, Jimin whispered. They clinked glasses, and no one looked away. Time, as always, moved forward. Their careers evolved. Solo albums, collaborations. Jungkook was invited to judge a global music competition. Jimin debuted his own fragrance line inspired by memory and emotion. But no matter where they went, what they did, they returned to each other. Home, they had come to realize, wasn't a place, it was a person. And so, in the stillness of an ordinary afternoon years later, when Jungkook knelt down in their living room, not with cameras, not with flash, but with a small silver band and eyes full of certainty, Jimin didn't cry. He smiled. Yes, he said, always yes. And as they kissed, soft and slow, the rain began to fall outside again. Not the kind that threatened storms. The kind that made everything bloom. The morning after the proposal was quiet, not with hesitation, but with peace. The kind of silence that came only after years of noise, after years of denying, doubting, running. Jimin lay curled beneath the cotton sheets, face turned toward the soft light bleeding through the curtain. Jungkook was still asleep beside him, mouth slightly parted, hair a messy crown against the pillow. His hand had never left Jimin's during the night. It remained there now, fingers gently curved over his knuckles like an unspoken vow. Jimin didn't move for a long time. He just watched him breathe, taking in the rise and fall of Jungkook's chest, the faint crease between his brows, the curve of his jaw where stubble had started to form. There was something sacred in this kind of intimacy, not in the grand gestures or public declarations, but in the simplicity of knowing someone so completely they could exist in stillness together and feel nothing missing. Eventually, Jungkook stirred. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim light, and the first thing he saw was Jimin watching him. You're starring, Jungkook mumbled, voice thick with sleep. Jimin smiled softly. You proposed to me last night. I'm allowed to stare. Jungkook groaned, burying his face in the pillow. God, I really did I? Jimin laughed, shifting closer. Yes, and I really said yes. Jungkook peeked out with one eye. We didn't even talk about rings. Jimin held up his hand, the silver band catching the light. You already knew what size I wore. I measured you while you were asleep, Jungkook confessed with a sheepish grin. Months ago. Jimin blinked. You serious? I had a plan. Jimin rolled on top of him, laughing into his chest. You're ridiculous. But now you're mine, Jungkook murmured, wrapping his arms around him. I've always been yours, Jimin whispered. They stayed like that until the sun fully climbed through the curtains and spilled over the hardwood floors. Until the city outside stirred to life. Until their phones buzzed with messages they ignored. When they finally emerged from their apartment later that afternoon, the world already knew. The ring on Jimin's finger had been caught in a grainy photo snapped by a passing fan, nothing staged, nothing formal. Just a quiet image of them walking side by side, coffee cups in hand, their fingers intertwined. The fan had posted it with a caption that simply read, "They look so happy." And they were. The internet exploded, of course, but the reaction was far more beautiful than they could have imagined. Fans flooded the hashtags with congratulations, edits, throwbacks, and messages of support. Former interviewers reposted clips of their most intimate moments on talk shows. Musicians who had once worked with them posted stories with hearts and broken keyboard emojis. Even idols from rival companies offered congratulations under thinly veiled captions. HYBE, surprisingly said nothing. They didn't need to. Silence in this case was permission. And for the first time in years, Jimin didn't feel the need to apologize for his joy. They celebrated quietly, the way they always did, dinner at home, music humming low from the speakers, takeout containers scattered across the coffee table, and Jimin curled into Jungkook's side on the couch, his feet tucked beneath a blanket, head resting on Jungkook's shoulder as they watched old performance videos and teased each other about their hairstyles. "You looked like a poodle in this era," Jimin said, pausing the screen. Jungkook smirked, "And you looked like an angel. Everyone had a crush on you. Even you. Especially me." Jimin grinned, nudging him gently. "Liar." "I wrote a whole album about it," Jungkook replied, eyes softening. "I know," Jimin whispered. Later, when the city slept and the lights dimmed, they lay in bed, their fingers tracing invisible maps across each other's skin. Jungkook's voice was quiet, barely a breath. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have looked like if we had done this sooner?" Jimin turned his face toward him. "Sometimes, but then I realized maybe we weren't ready. We were scared. We were kids." Jungkook nodded. "Do you regret it?" "No," Jimin said, "because every version of us led to this one." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to Jungkook's temple. "And this one is my favorite." In the months that followed, the world adjusted. The novelty wore off, the shock faded, and what remained was admiration, genuine, growing admiration. They began to be invited to speak not just as artists, but as voices of authenticity, of courage. Universities requested them for panels. Documentaries used their story as a case study in cultural shift. And most beautifully, young artists who had once been afraid to live their truths came forward, inspired by their bravery. They never became activists. They never intended to become icons. But by simply existing, by loving openly and without shame, they became both. And in all of that, the music never stopped. If anything, it became more honest, more raw. Their collaborations deepened, their harmonies grew more textured, more vulnerable. The lyrics cut deeper, the ballads burned softer, and when they performed side by side, there was no space between them, no emotional barrier, no restraint, just two voices, one story. They moved into a new home, not flashy, not enormous, just a quiet house on the edge of the city with a garden Jungkook tried to keep alive and a piano Jimin played in the mornings when the sunlight slanted perfectly across the wood. The walls held laughter, music, slow dances in the kitchen, arguments that ended in whispered apologies and tangled sheets. There were photos pinned to the fridge, Taehyung and Yoongi drunk on soju, Jin making his return from enlistment with a terrible mustache, Namjoon holding a puppy bigger than his torso. Their family remained intact, not despite the change, but because of it. And on one particularly golden afternoon, as Jimin watered the plants and Jungkook tuned his guitar on the porch, a small bird landed on the railing between them. They both froze. The bird tilted its head, blinked once, then let out a single chirp before flying off. Jimin watched it disappear into the sky, then turned to Jungkook. "What?" "You know what they say about birds," Jimin said. "That they're messengers. That they return where the love is." Jungkook smiled, setting the guitar aside. "Then we must have done something right." They didn't rush to marry. It wasn't about rings or ceremonies. It was about showing up, again and again, in big moments, in the everyday. Jimin in the audience of Jungkook's solo showcase, tears in his eyes. Jungkook backstage at Jimin's Paris debut, clutching a bouquet of white tulips. Them eating ramen at 2 a.m., laughing about old YouTube videos. Them sitting on opposite ends of the couch, working on separate projects but occasionally looking up to exchange a soft smile. Them arguing about dishes and finances and where to put the speakers, but never going to bed angry again. Love didn't fix everything, but it made everything worth fixing. And as they grew older, as the spotlight began to shift to younger artists, to new waves of talent, they didn't fear the fade. Because they had already lived something most people only dreamed of. They had turned pain into poetry. They had turned secrecy into sanctuary. They had turned a question into an answer. And when Jungkook, now 35, turned to Jimin on the night of their anniversary, the same silver band still resting on his finger, he said it once more, quiet, sure, eternal. "You're still my truth." Jimin looked at him, eyes glimmering under the soft lights. "And you," he said, voice steady, "are still my answer."